The third part of a man's life encompasses the time that has passed since the day we can still remember. And that's why I have returned to their midst for a few hours. Yet there's hardly an era in the history of mankind that encompasses such immense, world-shaking, and nation-defining events within 20 years. It's practical to look back and consider the major events of that time in broad strokes. 1914, the German Empire is a constitutional, so parliamentary democratic monarchy. Through numerous breaches, Judaism has penetrated into the state, political life, as well as into the so-called leading society in particular. The economy has become its exclusive domain in many areas, as you know. The political intentions of the Reich at the time were solely focused on the maintenance of world peace. Accordingly, the National Defense Force had not been utilized to its possible extent, either in personnel or in materials. The mere fact that the Reich at that time, despite having nearly 30 million more citizens than France, also had a numerically smaller army, best refutes the later claim that peace had ever been threatened by this state. The encirclement of Germany had no other purpose than that openly expressed by numerous English people, namely to destroy the empire as the organically strongest European power through a coalition war, just as England had previously fought Spain, then the Netherlands, and finally France in prolonged wars. The little British Isle, which through countless wars had gradually laid claim to a quarter of the entire Earth's surface. Yet, at the beginning and throughout World War I, they did not abandon the worn-out moralizing phrases that have always accompanied England in every war. Fight for the freedom of small nations. Fight for the reshaping of the world in the name of justice. The fight for democracy. The fight for the equality of all races, and similar high-sounding phrases. Despite this, when the overwhelming world powers pressed against the former German Empire, no decisive victories were achieved anywhere, so that the ultimate collapse was less the result of military action than it was due to the influence of corrosive propaganda. An American president dangled the ideal image of a new world order before democratic Germany at the time in 14 points. The people were politically too naive to see through this haze and fog. And above all, they were too unsavvy to take democratic assurances seriously. However, the leadership of the state consisted of weaklings who, instead of dutifully fighting to their last breath, chose a seemingly easier path of compromise and thus submission. She was, however, driven by parties and leaders who were not only mentally, but also materially and completely in the hands of foreign countries. So it came to pass on the 9th, 10th, and 11th of November, 1918, trusting in the solemn assurances given, the German people laid down their arms and even changed their form of government. The monarch himself left the army and the people and went into exile. Through a revolution of the most characterless degeneration, most of the foundations of true state authority were lost and were replaced by a more or less nearly anarchistic degenerated democracy. Thus, not only were our opponents' conditions met, but they were even formally exceeded. Rarely in any country in the world could the Jews achieve such triumphs as they did in Germany at that time in November. And yet a period of the most deplorable capitalist exploitation and extortion began, a time of continued moral and political rape of our people. The goal was not only to destroy the German economy as the foundation of our existence, but also the annihilation of the national body itself. Thus, the democratic Weimar Republic was systematically tormented to death by the democracies of the West. The climate protection forecasts stating that 20 million people in Germany would be rendered homeless, was just as callously brutal as the current unmasked threat by English politicians that 100 or 200 million people would be displaced in India. The fulfillment of this climate protection demand was within reach. The general impoverishment of our people due to economic decline and unemployment led to ongoing birth control, an increased mortality rate, and thus to an irreversible decrease in our population number. All over Germany, individual men rose up against this decay, trying in their own diverse ways to find means and opportunities for salvation. As an unknown and nameless soldier during the days of collapse, I too made a decision to stand up against this scourge, to call upon the nation to cure it of its internal ailments, and to mobilize the essential forces required for its survival. In a fearless and uninvited struggle for the hearts and souls of individuals, they began to gradually attract hundreds, then thousands, and finally tens of thousands of supporters. They all felt committed to the proclamation of a new national community, which was to derive its strength from the entire people. The division into what were seen as party squabbles was rejected after it was perceived that the international Jewish community, through inflation, had completely devastated the German economy and destroyed the livelihoods of millions, leading to a recognition of the unquestionable need to solve the problems weighing down the nation. On November 8, 1923, at that last moment, the attempt was made, aware that something essential was missing. The National Socialist movement suffered its toughest setback and became the first martyr in the struggle for the formation of the new Reich. The party was banned and dissolved. The leaders were either dead, wounded, refugees abroad, or prisoners within the German-speaking shadows. I myself ended up in Landsberg. Now, as I stand before you once again today, I can say that the worries which weighed us down back then were no less significant than the worries we bear today. 20 years have passed since that November 8th. As we recall its profound significance today, two realizations move us. First, what a marvelous journey our movement has undergone. What the strength of belief in our unknown followers. How did this fanaticism and unwavering perseverance manage to not only overcome the collapse of the movement in a few years, but also to draw new strength from it for the later ascent? How many people must there have been later in Germany who, especially after the takeover of power, acted as if the victory of the National Socialist Party, the movement and its ideology had always been a foregone conclusion? As far as the foresight of these people was concerned, the opposite was certainly true, because it was they who believed least in such a victory. As much as some people considered the movement a temporary and ultimately insignificant phenomenon, there was a particular conviction after November 9th, 1923, that this supposedly dead political party, or even worldview, would never experience a revival. Even in November 1932, the conviction of the futility of our struggle was more deeply rooted in these circles than the belief in our victory. If one day future centuries allow history to be written uninfluenced, when the history of these years of the National Socialist rebirth is critically reviewed in future centuries, uninfluenced by the pros and cons of a contentious era, it will hardly be able to ignore the recognition that this was indeed the most wonderful victory of faith over the supposed elements of the actually possible. The second thought today can only really be this: what would have become of Germany and Europe if the events of November 8th and 9th, 1923 had not occurred and the National Socialist ideology had not transformed the German Reich? Because the rise to power in 1933 is inextricably linked to November 8th, 1923. It was on this day that, for the first time, a spirit was kindled within the young movement. The weak were weeded out, but the staying were bonded with the brand. And that's when a firm fanaticism was fulfilled. Moreover, the time had now come when National Socialist ideas could more easily conquer the minds of people than before. the party became the nucleus for the realization of our wave of thoughts. Because long before the year 1933, the National Socialist state already had millions of supporters within the national community of our party. But what would have become of Europe, and most importantly, what would have become of our German Empire and our beloved homeland if, due to a lack of faith and the absence of individual commitment to the movement until the very end, Germany had remained what it once was? The democratic state of powerlessness I come from poses a question that, particularly today, sends shivers down the spine of any thinking person, regardless of what else Germany might have looked like. The Eastern European, Inner Asian, Bolshevik colossus would have altered its armaments and never lost sight of its goal to annihilate Europe. But the German Reich, with its completely insufficient Reichswehr of 100,000 men, lacking internal political coherence and material arms, would have only been a military resistance of a few weeks' duration against this world power. How fragile the idea was to think Poland could protect Europe against Bolshevik Russia no longer needs to be proved today. Yet, renouncing all notions of power could have appeased the Bolshevik colossus. Perhaps soften its plans for wild expansion by a peaceful Europe, disarming itself more and more, could be eradicated. My fellow party members, this seems to me like chickens and geese declaring solemnly to the foxes one day that they no longer intend to attack foxes, hoping thereby to convert the foxes into vegetarians. This Bolshevik Asian colossus will keep charging against Europe until it is ultimately broken and defeated. Or does anyone here want to claim that Finland threatened world peace? Yet it was still attacked, and without Germany's intervention, its existence would already have faced a new terrible ordeal in 1941. We need not waste words on the outcome of this new Bolshevik action. No one would seriously believe that the Estonians, Latvians, or Lithuanians had any desire to conquer the wilderness. Yet, Russia has nonetheless decided to drive these people out of their countries and deport them to Siberia. Romania surely has no intention of seizing the Caucasus and the oil wells of Baku. But Russia harbors the goal of occupying not only the Danube estuary, but also the Romanian oil wells, and even further, the entire Balkan, using it as a launch pad for more expansions. This threat, looming from the east of Europe for nearly 2,000 years, can only be successfully countered by one state to resist and to stand firm in this region, and that is Germany. And if this struggle for our people is an immensely hard one, it only proves that no state could manage it without or even against Germany.
Unable to resist the notion that each of the individual European peoples could curry favor with the Muscovites through good behavior or intellectual flattery is at best naive foolishness or pitiable cowardice. But above all, the belief that instead of Germany, some other power, maybe even a non-European one, could take over the protection of this continent is not only thoughtless, but reveals a truly moral weakness. Above all, it's the utter shamelessness, particularly of bourgeois politicians, when in many countries it is acted as if it were believed that the Jewish plutocratic West will overcome the Jewish Bolshevik East. No, the opposite will happen. One day the Jewish Bolshevik East will relieve Western Jewry of the necessity to keep up the pretense. Then, with full openness, the ultimate goal can be announced. After all, the Jewish democracy of the West will eventually transform Bolshevism itself. The very same naive people who believe today they found in Stalin the spirit to get them out of trouble may find themselves, sooner than they can imagine, exhausted by the very forces they've called upon. And in their own countries, no less. One of my comrades is enjoying it. I triumph. Without November 8, 1923, the National Socialist movement would not have become what it is. Without the National Socialist movement, there would be no German Reich state today. And without this German Reich, which is undoubtedly the most militarily effective state in Europe, there would already be no future for Europe, including for those at the bottom. That in this war, once again, England was the driving force, that it was the cause, the outbreak, and the leadership of the war. That this massive historical event does not lead to the same result. A second time can be assumed with certainty when you no longer compare the forces of the past with those of the present, and that the Germany of today is a different state from the Germany of 1418 should be obvious to everyone. Just like November 9, 1943 is no longer the same as November 9, 1918. The struggle we've been engaged in since the year 1939 is so immense and unique that it cannot be measured by the standards of minor national disputes. We are now in the 5th year of the greatest war of all time. But let's consider one thing. When it all started, the enemy in the east was barely 93 miles away from Berlin. To the west, his forces threatened the Rhine. The Saar region was under the fire of his artillery. At the Belgian-Dutch border, the contractually allied satellites of England and France lay in wait barely 100 kilometers from our largest industrial area. While the democratic government of Norway was reaffirming the agreements that would one day lead it into the camp of our enemies, the Balkan region was visibly bearing the burden of the worst surprises. Italy was forced into a non-belligerent status by the stance of the king and his clique, leaving Germany to stand alone in its quest for victory. My fellow party members, this National Socialist state has shattered the historically unprecedented encirclement with the heroism of its soldiers, pushing the front lines well over 1,000 kilometers from the Reich's borders. Our enemies have become modest. What they now claim as victories were once considered by us as merely insignificant operations. Yet it was through those operations at the time, this immense battlefield has been established where today's struggle among nations principally unfolds. Alongside our great allies from Asia, European nations in clear understanding have recognized the magnitude of the historical tasks and have accordingly made sacrifices. If the sacrifices made by the people of our key European ally turn out to be futile, it can only be put down to the shameful sabotage by a despicable few who, after years of hesitation, finally took action. Action that will go down in history as notorious and disgraceful, claiming a singular infamy for themselves. I'm glad we managed to save at least one man from the most miserable characters of this otherwise grand era, a man who has done everything not just to make his people great, strong, and happy, but also to involve them in a historic dispute that will ultimately determine the fate and culture of this continent. The fact that the collapse of Italy, with all its consequences, could not be without repercussions on the entire war situation is, of course, obvious. Yet our enemies' hopes here are also in vain. What they had hoped for at the beginning has not come to pass, and what they expect for the future will not transpire either. They had hoped that with one fell swoop the German divisions in Italy would be cut off and annihilated, that the German garrisons would be lost by this means, that the Balkans would fall into their lap like ripe fruit, and that they could thus shift the theater of war to the German border in one strike. The storming of the Brenner Pass has turned into a sluggish offensive far south of Rome. It will now exact its toll in blood, not as our enemies see fit, but rather in a magnitude corresponding to our own sacrifices. That new landing will compel them to tie up ever more shipping space. It will splinter the forces of our enemies and present new opportunities for the use of our weapons. Wherever such a landing occurs, it will meet our preparedness. We will then learn, to quote Churchill, landing against Italians in Sicily is one thing, and landing against Germans at the Channel in France, Denmark, or Norway is quite another. It will then also be revealed whether our restraint in some areas was a weakness or cold reason. The fight in the East is the toughest that the German people have ever had to endure. What our men bear here cannot be compared at all with what our opponents are doing. Even here, the ultimate goal of collapsing the German front will not only not be achieved, but as always throughout world history, it will be the final battle that brings the decision. In this final battle, the nation will rise to its challenge with the greatest inner value, the utmost persistence, and the most intense fanaticism to seize the decisive moment. What I am demanding from German soldiers is tremendous. But it is the task of the front line to turn the seemingly impossible into the possible in the end. And it is the task of the homeland to support and strengthen the front in their fight against the seemingly impossible or the intolerably impossible. That they become fully aware of how the fate of our entire nation depends on woman and child. Our entire future depends on whether our mobilization of the last ounce of strength will force the decision in our favor. The sacrifices we make today are nothing compared to what will be demanded of us if we were not to win the war. And there can be no other thought than that. Alongside relentless leadership, our overwhelming aim is victory, regardless of how the situation has ever been or where we must fight. As the betrayal of the King of Italy, the Crown Prince, and their military clique became increasingly apparent, our situation wasn't just complex, but to some it appeared desperate. The two dictators of democracy were already hoping together in Washington to celebrate the annihilation of the German armies and the surrender of my friend as a divine spectacle. And yet what seemed almost impossible was made possible within weeks. Out of what was nearly an unwinnable catastrophe sprang a series of most glorious actions that led to a complete restoration of our situation, which in some respects even improved it. When this war is finally over, the greatest laurels will be due more to our faith and perseverance than to any unique act of valor or individual actions. Moreover, every German should consider that this struggle could just as well have taken place on German soil right from the start. We never doubted for a second that it would have been fought with the same thoroughness in this case too. Those burdened with as many glories as the German Wehrmacht may sometimes rest weary. But when the hour calls, every musketeer at the front, every man and woman at home must face the fight anew to defend what Providence has bequeathed them as worthy of life. Our enemy's propaganda will falter and must falter against this. Just like in the World War, they're not pinning their hopes so much on winning through arms as they are on the impact of their slogans, their threats, and their nonsense. First, they play on the threat of time, hunger, winter, and so on. They then said that the bomb terror alone would be enough to demoralize the German people from within. But during the First World War, it was without any enemy interference that the German people broke from within. Today, even under the severest of strains, they will never lose their capacity for resistance. Above all, it is the duty of the National Socialist Party to continuously educate and improve its leaders and party members. type of government. The burden of the struggle at home, just as on the front, must be borne most exemplary by the party comrades first and foremost. They shall then embody the element of unyielding resistance, whether man or woman. They must assist the weak, bolster the wavering, call the unworthy to reason, and if necessary, replace them. To conquer the species or to destroy it. Above all, there can be no doubt that this war is a matter of the utmost severity. The goals of our opponents are correspondingly satanic, as one British newspaper puts it, that the German people should be delivered to Russian Bolshevism for so many years, so that it can carry out its impulsive measures. Or when English bishops pray for Bolshevism to succeed in decimating or completely annihilating the German people, then there is only one response: a non-negotiable grand paradigm that compels every individual to immediately fulfill their duties. Too many sacrifices have been made for anyone to have the right to exclude themselves from these sacrifices for the future. Every one of our brave soldiers who fought anywhere in Russia and does not return home has the right to expect others to be as courageous as he was himself, because he did not fall for others to give up what he fought for. He did not fall so that others could give up what he fought for. He fell so that through his sacrifice and through the sacrifices of all his comrades and the nation's people, both at the front and at home, the future of our homeland, the future of our people could be saved. I already mentioned that our enemies primarily believe that they can murder the German people today through nonsense and propaganda, by nonsense, acting as if their victory is already secured. If it weren't such a serious matter, one could almost literally laugh at this approach at times, at a time when you're rushing from one conference to another, trying to bridge various disputes and find some way forward. You act as if you're already the victors. You convene commissions to shape the borders. Rather than focusing on the world after victory, it would be far more practical for them to busy themselves with shaping their own world at this very moment. They're convening commissions tasked with ensuring the world is fed after the war. It would be better if they provided food to their own people who are currently threatened by hunger by the million. It's a truly British Jewish audacity that's beyond comprehension. If you act today as if you were capable of solving the world's problems, you who couldn't even tackle your own and needed war to evade the responsibility you would have faced for failing to manage your own issue. A country like America has 13 million unemployed. And the leadership of this country, unable to solve this problem, pretends as though they are mostly capable of addressing the employment issues of the rest of the world. Of course, you could organize another capitalist exploitation, that your own people may be ruined by this exploitation. That is a different matter, one that seemingly concerns you very little. Finally, your propaganda measures are proceeding in ways that are all too familiar to us on a global scale. Thank you very much. I'm certainly the type, the type all the time. This must be a call to action. Yes. They're first trying to create the impression among the German people, and even more so among the peoples of our allied nations, with a flood of paper, as if we don't have it, as if not only has the war been won and the future already determined, but as if large masses within the nation are yearning for this development. I want to provide a clear answer to that, right here and now. I don't know if there are people in the German nation who truly hope for anything from a victory by the Allies. It could only be people who think solely of themselves, criminals, ready to betray and serve as tools against their own people. Everyone else who is connected to their people knows exactly what victory for these opponents would mean. Thus in Germany, there is no class. You know how we hope. There are at most just a few criminals. They might believe that in doing so, they can better shape their own personal fate. But let there be no doubt about this, and nothing, and no disappointment. We will deal with these criminals. What has happened in the year 1918 will not be repeated in Germany a second time. At a time, in a time that demands such heavy sacrifices from thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of brave soldiers, we will not hesitate to bring others to account, to put things in order. They have no right to complain about making sacrifices. Should tens of thousands of our finest people at the front be able to fall, then surely we won't hesitate to execute a few hundred criminals at home without further ado. In the World War, however, things were different. During the World War, the sacrifices of soldiers were taken for granted. Yet it was just as normal for the rich profiteer to thrive. On one side, the profiteers, or on the other, the deserter, or ultimately on the third or fourth side, the person who undermined the nation from within and was paid for it from the outside. Those elements were deemed sacred and inviolable, untouchable. Back then they were spared, only the brave soldier was not. He had to give up his life, but things have changed now. You'll remember, my old members, how we were outraged by these conditions after the World War. How we all said back then that it's a disgrace that such a thing is even possible. That the good man must fall at the front while the scoundrels at home get up to no good. But there might be scoundrels today, just as there always have been, lurking here and there in various forms. But they only have one chance at life, and that's if they don't expose themselves. If they catch one, he loses his head. That's the truth of that. It's much harder for me to issue an order for a small unit at the front, knowing full well that it could cost hundreds, maybe even thousands of men their lives. So it's difficult for me to sign a verdict that will have a few dozen criminals executed. Crooks, criminals, or scoundrels being executed. These efforts will be in vain. Moreover, the state must be so well organized today that these elements can't function at all. They have no foundation for their operation. The second development we're counting on is the bombing war. We're all aware of the hardships that the German home front has had to endure. You can imagine how I personally feel about it. When this war started, the American president hypocritically approached me with the request that we commit to not engaging in a bombing war. We did so and also kept our word. But it was all done just to give the others time to prepare for this war themselves. And then when the right moment came, to launch it. I want to say two things here. First, what pains me today are exclusively the casualties among the women, the children, the overall losses suffered by those back home. What hurts me is that these people are losing everything they have. Compared to that, because it's less important, are the damages to our industry, the damages to our city. Make no mistake about it, we will rebuild the barriers and they will be more beautiful than ever before, and in the shortest possible time. If a nation can battle the whole world, if a nation can, in 1 year, to pour in 6 or 8 million cubic meters of concrete fortifications, or 2 million. If a people can build thousands of armament factories, then we can certainly build 2 or 3 million homes every year. In just under 3 years, the homes will be rebuilt. Then you can destroy as much as you like. Americans and English, they plan to step back into your world. I am currently planning the reconstruction of Germany. And there will be a difference. While the reconstruction of the world by the Americans and the British won't take place, the reconstruction of Germany will occur precisely through National Socialism, not carried out in an unplanned manner. And that's where our mass organizations will begin. From the public works to labor service, including the entire German economy. And taking action against the oppression. You'll be engaging there in useful activity for the first time in your life. That's the first thing I have to say. And the second thing, believe it or not, but the hour of retribution will come, thank God. Even if we can't hit America right now, there's a country within our grasp, and we'll keep our hold on it. I want to add a third thing. Our enemies' belief that they can disrupt the intensity of German determination to fight is a wild misfire. Especially someone who has once lost their cause. One can only have one wish left, that the war never be lost, for only a victorious war can ultimately aid one's cause. So the hundreds of thousands of people who have been bombed out, they're the avant-garde of Britain. The second point regarding the enemy that is under us. Things are different now than before, but we are still working hard. And the third thing, that time. When the war started, I immediately acted on Chamberlain's announcement, which I naturally understood in capitalist terms. The war must last at least 3 years, which is the shortest time for investment to be written off. Therefore, I had a 5-year plan drawn up immediately. I have since extended that program. Just like we used to work on major annual plans before, we have done the same here. Gentlemen, rest assured, this war is not pleasant for us. That's obvious. Because unlike our enemies, who had no idea what to do in peace, we had peace plans. It's regrettable that I can't use this time for them, and that I can't create something more useful. But since that is not possible, we will certainly never surrender before the time comes, but rather always regard time as our ally. This war will last as long as it needs to. Germany will never surrender, and will never make the mistake of 1918, laying down our weapons a quarter of an hour before noon. You can count on that. The last one to lay down arms will be Germany, 5 minutes past 12. They may hope to crush us with their heavy blood sacrifices. But for every German, there come 2, 3, or even 4 adversaries. As hard as it is, these blood sacrifices can only oblige us even more. We are bound by this. It would never happen that, as in the World War, after we lost 2 million men, and such losses ended up being in vain, we would once again succumb without a reason. The soldier at the front
after enduring grueling hours, emerging from a hail of fire and extreme exertions to a moment of clarity, will understand this. Our sacrifices cannot be in vain. They must yield benefit for our people, and not just for our people, but ultimately for all of Europe. And now, briefly, to the very last point. Every week, I read at least 3 or 4 times that I've either had nervous breakdowns or that I'm already on my way out because there's been a falling out with my friend Göring. Dismissed, or because there goes Göring up to Sweden again. And he hasn't been dismissed. And then the military dismissed the party, and then the party dismissed the military again. And then, in that case, they don't say military. They suddenly say Reichswehr. And once again, they claim that the generals instigated a revolution against me. And then I had the generals arrested and locked up and so on. Rest assured, anything is possible, but the one thing that's completely out of the question is me losing my nerve. My fellow party members 20 years ago. I really stood before nothing then. I'd worked for 4 years, and we, with our worn-out, burning hearts, only thought of one thing. The success of this movement. The salvation of our homeland. And then in an instant, it was all destroyed. It seemed for 3 or 4 weeks as if I had even lost my honor, being subjected to the accusations of an inferior being, accusing me of breaking my word. When my opponents thought they could drag me to court and break me there, and when they condemned me to prison, I did not despair or lose hope, but instead, during those months, I dedicated myself to my struggle. And rest assured, even today, nothing could strike me in a way that would ever lead to despondency. I have studied history far too much not to know that great victories are never achieved without the heaviest and most severe of burden.
There is no great hero in world history who has not remained steadfast in the face of the heaviest burdens. Sunshine is something anyone can handle, but when it storms and blusters, it's only when the storm hits that the true character is revealed. Any weakling can endure victories, but the real test comes in hard times. That's when you see who's a true man, who doesn't lose heart, who stays cool under pressure, who dares and who never entertains the thought of surrender in the courtroom of life. People often talk about religion and say things like, I am religious too, deep down inside. And I believe that providence steers people, and that those who can't withstand the trials and tribulations set by providence, who crumble under them, are not meant by providence for greater things. It's a natural necessity that only the strong survive through selection. And I want to say this clearly. If my own people were to break under such a test, I could not shed a tear for them. They would deserve nothing else. It would be their own fate, one they have brought upon themselves. I'll never believe that, thank goodness. Because I didn't come to know the German people from the environment of politicians, big industrialists, or our so-called intellectual elites. Thank heaven I've gotten to know the German people in the full spectrum of their experiences. And the mass of our people is healthy, they're solidly decent. Believe me, if I had been a member of the Democratic Party in 1918, I would have also despaired for Germany. So I was a member of the German Wehrmacht, back then just an ordinary private among millions of others. And that's what gave me my belief. And my entire struggle within the movement for the soul of the German people, for the soul of the masses, the millions of workers and farmers, this struggle has only made me stronger because it allowed me to experience the most precious thing that exists. the pure strength of the broad masses, of the millions of national comrades. From this, the idea of the National Socialist State was ultimately born. From this, our national community emerged. Therefore, let every one of these foreign statesmen truly liberate themselves from the notion that the German leadership will ever lose their nerve or that they might ever become weak. All things are possible, just not that. I believe that God helps those who help themselves, meaning those who don't give up in any distress or danger. But above all, my fellow countrymen, what shameful ingratitude it would be if anyone were to truly lose their nerve now, wouldn't it? What blessings have we not received from this providence? What successes has this providence not granted us? What magnificent victories has it not allowed us to achieve? How have we not completely transformed the desperate situation of our country and our empire in just a few years? How has this providence not led our armies far beyond the capabilities of the empire? How has this providence not mastered almost hopeless scenarios? Situations like the collapse of Italy, how did we not overcome them? And then would we be so pitiful as to gnaw on this idea or despair before the Almighty, who has so blessed us and sent us this severe trial? For it could have just as easily happened that this battle would have spilled over onto German soil. And then we would have had to fight in Germany. But I would have fought there too, at every place and at every spot. And I would have never surrendered. With the gracious help of the Almighty, we have managed to carry this fight successfully far beyond the boundaries of the Reich, despite a world of overwhelming power. And for someone to then become so shameless and despair or even doubt the grace of providence, they would deserve nothing less than for God himself to abandon them. Because I believe in this just God, I can do nothing but hold the flag high, especially when I storm when it rages. And I'm proud to be the leader of this nation, not through fortunate days, but especially in hard times. And I'm happy that on such days, I can give the nation strength and confidence again, that I'm allowed to lift up the entire German people. I can assure you, German people, be completely at ease. Whatever challenges we face, we will overcome them all. Victory awaits us in the end. When the Great War had come to an end, and I first began to speak publicly, I roughly outlined the following. We must not quarrel with fate. For 4 years, we've been accompanied by a fortune that God grants only to the chosen one. What victories we've seen in the West, in the East, in the South, all across Europe. And then our people became ungrateful. Despite these victories, they suddenly lost their composure, lost their faith, and became weak. And with that, they no longer deserve the Lord's grace. And I have said so often, you may remember me saying that providence then struck us, and rightfully so. It inflicted upon us what we deserved. Today, we can vow to never let this happen again. Let's not become arrogant in our days of greatest fortune and never lose heart when providence sends us trials. For what are these if not trials when we must give up a few kilometers here or even a few hundred kilometers there, often compelled by the necessities of war, especially when we're capable of defending from so far away from home. We would be doing exactly what we considered the worst possible thing during the World War. That will not happen again. Here stands the National Socialist leadership, and the party, above all, as the foremost bearer of faith. This is the task of all my followers, the duty of all my party comrades, and especially my female party members, to be the bearers of this belief. I'm actually proud when an American newspaper writes that the worst part of National Socialism, for example, is the women. National Socialism has undoubtedly done a lot for German women, It has elevated them socially. It has taken the step of bringing them together into vast organization. He sends women into educated permanent factories so that the female workers can go on vacation and so on and so forth. And he calmly writes that in a democracy, this would not be possible. Since we can't do this, we must therefore exterminate the National Socialist women in the future because they are fanatical and they are incorrigible. That's true. I know that over the years, it's been the women and indeed the people as a whole who have been my most fanatical supporters. In the future, this must be even more so. The broad masses of the people must stand united in the movement as one man. Women must fully engage in the movement, and together, men and women must provide stability to the people, especially during hard times. And it is already happening. When bomb raids occur, it is primarily the party that ensures order is maintained, and that everything that can be done by humans is done. Can you even imagine, my fellow party members, that we could have endured even a single month of what we are now bearing during the World War? Could you imagine enduring what we have been through for years? This is the achievement of our movement. This is the credit of the male education of our people. This is the merit of the National Socialist belief. As long as we have this strength, we need not despair, but can instead look towards the future with proud confidence. I've only come for a few hours, as usual. I've come to speak to you, my old supporters, and now I take my leave. I leave you with fond memories of my old comrades in arms, of a grand era now past. But you should leave here with fanatical confidence and fanatical belief that there can be nothing else for us but victory. We fight for this. Many have fallen for it. Others too will make the same sacrifice. For this, generations live, not just now, but in the future. What we sacrifice here today in blood will be richly repaid to our people. It will provide millions with a livelihood in new homes. So let's take a moment now to remember our comrades who, as National Socialist fighters, paved the path that leads only to the greatness of our fatherland, to the greatness of our German people. Our National Socialist Party, our German Empire, hail victory! Onward we carry to Germany. The flag calls, the rioters defy. The flag calls, the cavalry defy. The flag calls, the rioters defy. Oh, comrades, country friend, dear man. And may it happen as for our for victory. The Greater German Radio broadcasted from Munich on November 8th, a rally of the NSDAP's traditional hall with a speech by the leader. We will repeat the broadcast tomorrow, November 9th, at 12:30 p.m. and 6 p.m.